workers. The Future Work Initiative is grateful to Be Solo and Fidelity Labs for sponsoring today's event. The topic of independent work has been a core area of focus for our project, as our mission has been to examine how work is changing in the 21st century and help identify concrete solutions that are responses to those changes. As independent work encompasses work outside of a traditional employer-employee relationship, it includes low and high-wage workers and can be found in all major industries in our economy. It includes rideshare drivers and those who obtain work through online platforms. It includes contract workers who provide specific services for companies but are not directly employed by those companies, and can also include what we may think of as more traditional independent contractors, such as painters and higher wage workers as well, such as management consultants and software programmers. The independent workforce, which is sometimes referred to as the gig economy, has been a sector of the workforce that has received considerable attention, in particular around questions around its size and growth. We have spent time as a project analyzing those questions, and in partnership with Cornell's ILR School, we have created an online gig economy data hub to provide a synthesis of the research that has been done on the size and growth of the gig economy to date. And if you're interested, we encourage you to visit the website at gigeconomydata.org. But the purpose of today's program is not to examine the size or growth of the gig economy. Rather, the purpose is to look at independent workers through the lens of their financial health. Financial challenges that independent workers can face include less access to health insurance, less access to retirement, as they're less likely to be able to receive these benefits from an employer. In addition, they often experience higher degrees of income volatility and have more difficulty saving for the future than traditional workers. And to help us better understand these challenges and the potential solutions, we're fortunate to have an excellent group of policymakers and experts here with us today. First, we'll hear from Congressman Jim Himes, who represents Connecticut's 4th District, a district that includes Bridgeport, one of the poorest cities in Connecticut, but also includes some of the wealthiest parts of Connecticut, like Greenwich. He is currently the chair of the New Democrat Coalition. He and his colleagues in the New Dem Coalition have been leaders within the House of Representatives in examining the questions around the future of work, and moreover, have advanced the conversation around solutions by releasing an economic opportunity agenda that is designed to help American workers prepare for the jobs of the future. After Congressman Himes, we'll hear from an expert panel moderated by Yuki Noguchi from NPR. Yuki is a correspondent on the business desk based out of NPR's headquarters here in DC and has been covering business and economic news since joining NPR in 2008. She will be joined by Duke Chang of Be Solo, Kosar Jahani of Sama School, David Mitchell of the Aspen Institute's Financial Security Program, independent worker Sarah Bailey, and Shelley Stewart, research manager at the Future Work Initiative. Unfortunately, Kathleen Delaney Thomas, who was originally going to join our panel, is a tax law professor from the University of North Carolina, and is unable to join due to the hurricane. You'll notice on your seat you have a note card. If you have any questions that you already know that you'd like to ask the panel, please write them down on the note card. We'll collect the questions right before the panel begins, following Congressman Himes' remarks in the Q&A. Before I turn it over to Congressman Himes for his remarks, I wanted to highlight that one of the financial challenges that independent workers face is just simply filing their taxes. For individuals, taxes are a pay-as-you-go system, largely set up for workers in a traditional employment relationship. Employers, as I'm sure most of you know, withhold a portion of your paycheck each pay period to cover income and payroll taxes, send that amount to the IRS or Social Security. Employers then send employees a W-2, January or February, documents the income that's been earned and the taxes that have been withheld throughout the previous year. Finally, employees file their taxes once a year, usually by April 15th, and most receive a refund. But for independent contractors, the tax system is much more complicated because there is no employer withholding taxes that are due and often no reporting of income that is earned. Independent contractors are expected to predict their annual income and make estimated tax payments 4 times per year, facing irregular and often substantial tax bills. In fact, to illustrate the two different worlds that traditional and independent workers live in when it comes to taxes, how many people are aware or have read any stories about the next tax filing deadline for independent workers, which is coming up in just 3 days? To help simplify the tax filing process for independent workers, we released a new proposal earlier today that recommends expanding the responsibilities for employers to provide income reports and withholding for independent contractors. In addition, to simplify the burdensome process that independent contractors must face to claim a business deduction, we have also proposed a standard business deduction for independent workers. The simple goal of these provisions is just to make it easier for independent workers to accurately calculate and file their taxes, a benefit that traditional employees enjoy. And in the process of doing that, to improve the financial health of these workers. If you'd like to learn more about the proposal, we have copies of our issue brief in the back of the room, or actually in the table right outside the room. And it's also available online at the Aspen Institute Future of Work Initiative website. It is now my honor to invite Congressman Jim Himes to the stage, or to the podium, I should say, start us off with remarks and additional ideas on ways to improve the financial health of independent workers.
Thanks, Al. And broadly, thanks to the Aspen Institute for doing this. This is a really critical topic and part, if I can just expand outside of this room, part of remarkable work that the Aspen Institute does, including the congressional program, which brings a lot of Democrats and Republicans together every week to talk about important things. But I'm particularly grateful for this program. There is a small cabal of folks, I think many of you belong to the organizations that are doing this, who are trying to think forward about where we are and where we're going and what we should do about it, because we understand how important thinking about the future of work is, not just to our economy, but to individuals in that economy, and quite frankly, from my perspective, to our politics. And I'm going to speak for less than 15 minutes, so we leave ample time for Q&A and a dialogue. But suffice it to say that a lot of what we see in our politics, which some of us would label a little pathological, happens because people are feeling disenfranchised, alienated, removed from the American dream, from the middle class in ways that causes them to seek fantastical solutions politically. And one of the ways to address that, of course, is to think about where the economy is going and what needs to be put in place to allow generations forward to experience the kind of prosperity and upward mobility that so many of our parents and grandparents experienced. And by the way, when I mentioned grandparents, the issue here is very, in some sense, illustrated by my family. My grandparents lived exactly the life that their generation lived, and radically differently than we live today. Grandpa on one side, entire career womb to tomb at the DuPont Corporation. Grandpa on the other side, womb to tomb at Eastman Kodak. One job, entire career, right out of college, all the benefits and protections that came from working for an American corporation at the time. An interesting time, right, because not nearly as globalized or as competitive than American corporations deal with today. But nobody lives that way anymore. Nobody in this room, I suspect, lives that way. I certainly don't. I'm probably an outlier today in that I've had, 4 jobs in the last 25 years. Hopefully after November 6th, it will also be 4 jobs in the last, in the last 25 years. But you know the challenge here. People jump from job to job, in between jobs. They may work in the gig economy, and we have a legal structure and all of the protections, what we call the safety net, what we call the social contract within the New Democrats, that was really built 2 generations ago. And we see this problem coming, and what I can offer you in the next 14 minutes is not necessarily expertise on any of the particular specifics on tax filing, but a sense of what the challenges are politically and what the opportunities are politically. So I chair the New Democrat Coalition. The New Democrat Coalition, for those of you who are unfamiliar with us, we're 68 Democrats. We call ourselves forward-thinking, innovative. A lot of people call us moderate centrist Democrats. We do tend to come out of those purple districts, and as such, we're more drawn to talking to everybody on both sides of the aisle. Our constituents are both both parties are important to us. A lot of us have private sector experience. And we are also, what I like best about the New Democrat Coalition is that I think we're really the policy shop within the Democratic caucus. We really do get interested in the details of policy and legislating in ways that hopefully begin to address this problem. And the Aspen Institute and Third Way and any number of other groups have been really important to us, as has a number of offices over on the Senate side, Mark Warner in particular, who's been involved with the Aspen Institute for some time. So let me very quickly just do a couple of things. One, just outline the problem from a political perspective, tell you how the New Democrats are thinking about it, and then give you a perspective on what some of the challenges are legislatively. Because the problem here is one that is going to require a focus on the politics and the legislation. It's going to require the private sector to be at least open-minded, and I'm going to come back to that, but hopefully aggressive in thinking forward about what we need in the generations to come, and even the philanthropic sector. This is a problem to be solved in real collaboration, which is one of the things that makes it fun. I don't need to tell you the problem. I mean, there's a million ways to describe it. You know people who are living in the gig economy. The classic headline, of course, is that there are 3.5 million truck drivers in this country, and we hear this over and over and again, and everybody sort of agrees that sometime in the next 5 to 20 years there will be 0 truck drivers in this country. We know that, so much so that I just bored you in telling that, and we are doing absolutely nothing about it, which is a shame. Now, in the New Democrat Coalition, we believe that that is a huge opportunity. Every time, if you look at over the last 240 years of this country's history, every time there has been a dramatic shift in the way business is done, more jobs come out of the back end that get lost in the front end. So that disruption, what the economists call disruption, which can be tragic for the people who get caught up in it, on net usually ends up with a lot more jobs. So the question is, are the people who get caught in the disruption also the people who get to benefit from the fact that generally those kinds of changes produce more jobs than they disrupt? The answer, sadly, has been no. And as a result, I think, again, just to point back to what I said before, we have these political challenges, this political anger that we see out there. And you know the causes. At the top of the list, of course, are globalization and automation, probably in the reverse order in which I just listed them. Automation, I don't need to tell you that story. Not a ton of brick and mortar bookstores out there anymore. Not a ton of travel agents out. You know that story, and that's where, of course, truck drivers are going. Globalization, of course, has created a world much more competitive than my grandfathers faced when they were at Fortune 100 companies 50 years ago, and displaced a lot of workers. In the face of those two huge changes, of course, we've got inertia educationally. I just sent my daughters back to school in September. They were presumably home to help bring in the harvest in August. Well, we didn't bring in a harvest in Coscob, Connecticut. My point being that, we have this educational structure that was set up 100 years ago for an agrarian society that still obtains today. And even if you don't look that far back, we're still, and I'll use the words, even though it's probably a little prejudicial, stuck in the mode of the be-all, end-all is a 4-year liberal arts degree at an elite university, which is less and less, I think, applicable to the kind of training and education that people from a vocational standpoint will need. And then, of course, regulatory inertia. Again, all of the laws and the regulations do not move nearly at the rate that innovation moves. Exacerbated, of course, by the last factor, we're, I guess, 10 years away from the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers. And, of course, that economic dislocation, as bad as anything we'd seen since 1929, really put a sharp edge on this problem for a lot of workers. So what are we doing about it? What do the New Democrats propose to do? We think of this, and I hope you'll get a look at the report that we put out there. We're in the process of releasing a series of 3 papers that touch on the 3 themes and organizing principles that we have here. The first is called, and it's out there, Closing the Skills and Opportunity Gap. Pretty obvious what that is. How do we make sure that people have the training for the jobs that are out there? We feel this in Connecticut. There are a lot of jobs at Pratt & Whitney, at Electric Boat, that are going begging because people don't have the training to do welding in a radioactive environment the way you need to understand how to do if you're going to work on Virginia-class submarines, for example, at Electric Boat. So you've got a lot of jobs that are out there. You've got a lot of people looking for jobs, but you don't have that bridge that allows those two things to obviously connect. Secondly, rethinking the way a worker relates to his or her employer. Again, in my grandfather's era, health insurance, disability insurance, retirement plans, all provided by the company, and of course in sort of a joint venture with the government, because the government offers the tax incentives that get companies to either offer health care or other benefits. Again, not there. So what do the next generation of benefits need to look like? And then finally, empowering more workers. Both of my grandfathers could do what they did because both of their wives stayed home to look after their kids. That doesn't happen a lot anymore. And so that points you to questions around childcare and other stuff. Questions about what's the future of the labor movement in this country? A key part of the development of the middle class in this country came because over 100 years, labor unions demanded their share of the pie. And of course, as you all know, the labor movement is smaller than ever before, particularly in the private sector. And so what's going to be out there that allows workers to make sure that they get a fair share of the profits of the value that they produce? So specifically, let me focus, just in order to keep this crisp. We talked a little bit about education and maybe rethinking that model of the 4-year liberal arts education being the be-all, end-all. Why is it 4 years? Why not 3? Why are universities necessarily geographic locations? Why do you get a piece of paper that says you're done? Why not have a requirement, or at least the opportunity, to every year update your skills in such a way so that you know you stay ahead of whatever machine or whatever AI is eating away the more routine aspects of your job? There's a whole conversation to be had there. There's a lot of room there for the private sector, universities in particular, but the private sector as a whole, to really think about how to train up workers, how to close that gap between people seeking work and people looking for workers. There are obviously challenges. Firms worry that if they invest a ton of money in the ongoing education and training of their employees, that employee could walk across the street. Fair question. How do they deal with that? How can we innovate in such a way to encourage the private sector to get over those kinds of fears? On benefits, I happen to be working on a plan actually with Senator Warner that would, over time, create a fully portable retirement account, so that if you do go from a Fortune 100 company to a period in the gig economy to opening up your own firm, you would take that retirement account with you and be able to fund it regardless of the nature of your employment. A lot of this will require, of course, something that I know a lot more about than I know about how philanthropy and the private sector can help. It will require legislative change. We somehow need to find a way to update an awful lot of the incentives that were created in the 30s, for the most part, around the provision of benefits to help with the concept of portability, of universality, of having some innovation. Those 3 principles are kind of key to the New Democrats in the area of benefits. One of the best examples we have of this, and it's best in terms of the direction it was going, not necessarily purely in its execution, but the Affordable Care Act points us in the direction of portability. Again, there'll be different opinions about the Affordable Care Act in the room, but one thing that I think was an unquestionable good was the establishment of these exchanges. So that now, I used to give this example when I was doing my 19th healthcare town hall meeting in Fairfield County, that entrepreneurial individual who was working in a corporation in Stamford, Connecticut, who also happened to have diabetes or an experience with breast cancer, or maybe even was thinking about having a child someday, under those circumstances, pre-ACA, you never would have left that corporation because you probably would have been uninsurable in the private market. Post-ACA, with the provision that pre-existing conditions can't be disqualifying, and with the existence of exchanges out there, that individual can now leave the corporation and go start that business, not worrying about the devastation that comes potentially if you don't have health insurance. So that's actually a real live example of something that the government was able to do. Remains obviously enormously controversial to this day, and that points me to the last observation I want to make. Good news is that a lot of this stuff need not be partisan. So for example, the portable retirement account that I'm working on is not necessarily going to require any funding from the government, which of course is a challenge for my friends on the other side of the aisle. And therefore, I would hope to be able to draw bipartisan support. The challenge in the Congress is more about urgency. And this points to a larger challenge that stems from the nature of the place. And I sometimes will explain to crowds less sophisticated than this one with respect to the operations of DC, that it's a mistake to think of Capitol Hill as a fight between Democrats and Republicans. That's one model. A better way to think of what happens on Capitol Hill is that it is a fight between legacy businesses and legacy social programs and the future. And it tends to break down a little bit by party. The Republicans tend to stand up for legacy businesses, and I do mean legacy businesses, right? Extractive industries, agriculture, old metal bending industries. The Democrats tend to stand up in aggressive, probably overly aggressive fashion, non-innovative fashion for the preservation of the social insurance programs of the 1930s and the 1960s. Don't even think about talking about Social Security and Medicare. And in the face of that defense of legacy institutions, it's very, very hard for somebody to say, hey, shouldn't we create some room for innovation in any of those areas? And the answer out of Capitol Hill is more often than not going to be no. This struck me in about my third year in Congress when I was sort of standing amongst these columns and thinking I could be standing in ancient Rome. And I realized, yeah, this place is about actually preserving the way we have always done business. And that creates an immense amount of inertia against the kind of innovation that is important. The other challenge, of course, is the challenge of timing and scale. I get very, very frustrated because I've been thinking about and talking about this for a long time without a lot of actually tangible progress, at least with respect to the government. And the problem is there. Again, I believe profoundly, as I've now said 3 times, that the nature of our politics comes out of the sense of alienation and disenfranchisement that a lot of people who got left behind by the change in our economy are feeling. And this is accelerating. It's not decelerating, right? The advent of AI and just the pace at which we're going to see, despite the downtick in our engagement economically with the world, the rate at which we see innovation coming out of other countries and competition coming out of other countries, this problem is accelerating, and we are not moving nearly fast enough to do everything that I've been discussing to provide the worker out there with the tools and the training and the education that they need to be what Americans want to be, which is middle class. So I'll just close on this point. I guess it's up to me as chairman of the New Democrats, and maybe there's some chance that we move into the majority after November. That'll give us a lot more momentum in terms of actually putting forward legislation, incorporating a lot of the ideas that I have talked about. But there's also a good chance that the private sector is going to have to step up in a way that it hasn't yet to date, and not just demand change and innovation of Washington, but actually try things. Try innovative approaches to training workers, to providing workers with more safety than they would ordinarily experience in a very competitive market. I have this theory that concerns me as a Democrat, which is that we may be past the era of big government-driven changes. There's an argument that the Affordable Care Act, imperfect though it may be, sort of finished the era of government making big changes. That doesn't mean it can't make incremental changes, but I do think that the private sector is going to solve a lot of the problems out there. When I get stuck on traffic on 95, which I do every day that I'm in Connecticut, I think about what government can do, and I guess we could widen 95. I guess we could do this and that. What's really going to fix 95 where I come from is self-driving cars that put 10 feet between cars that move at 70 miles an hour down the highway. So again, that's going to be innovation in the private sector that fixes this. And I'm not smart enough to tell you exactly what that innovation in private sector change looks like in the area of worker support and training and benefits, but I do suspect that that's going to be a big part of it, perhaps even bigger than what we're able to do on Capitol Hill. And therefore, it's going to be important for you guys to evangelize this and hopefully get the kind of spirit of innovation that you sometimes see in Palo Alto, you sometimes see in places like Boston and Austin and New York City. Get those minds in the private sector really thinking about how they can just push this old legacy institution on the hill behind me, but also on how they can innovate new models, new supports, and new structures that allow more Americans to be middle class. Thank you. How are we going to move over here?
Thank you, Congressman. I appreciate a lot of food for thought in your remarks. And I would encourage people, if they haven't already, if they have questions that they want to ask the panel, you have note cards, and if you want to write down questions, I encourage you to do so. I guess, Congressman, I'll start with a question about what you're seeing, not just in the United States, but around the world. You're talking about how things are changing. Obviously, that's not just in the United States. You have countries that are experiencing the same trends that we're experiencing, whether it's automation, globalization, rise of the independent workforce. Part of your research that you're doing and the work that you're doing in the New Dem Coalition, are there any, I'm just curious, are there any models of from other countries that you think we should potentially take a look at in terms of addressing some of these challenges that you've just laid out?
Yeah, great question. First of all, as you look around the world, the story is amazing with respect to what globalization is doing. And that sounds almost heretical in this room because, as a late post-industrial economy, we're feeling the pain of another switch in what drives our economy, obviously from manufacturing to service. Most of the world, at least probably 3/4 of the world by population, is actually on the other end of the curve. They are moving out of poverty faster than ever before, and they get to skip stuff. There's rural villages in India where you go straight to an iPhone. Don't have to deal with the 70 years of fixed line telephones that we had. So globally, the story is really pretty amazing. But it would be smart for those companies in the middle, those countries in the middle of the curve, to start thinking about what they can do. And some of them are. You asked for a specific example. And it's great that there's these examples out here because it means we don't have to cook them up from scratch. Chile on retirement funds. All right, a little esoteric. But Chile has implemented a largely universal, portable, private sector-driven retirement safety net. Probably more private sector-driven. Thank you, Augusto Pinochet, but more private sector driven than we would tolerate in this country with our tradition of Social Security. But my point is, they did a lot of thinking about it. They put in place a portable private sector universal retirement plan, and we should be willing to learn from what they did as we think through how we do what we need to do.
Okay, that's interesting. And I guess a question, you were talking about training, so I want to ask you a question about Germany, since there's a lot of conversations around apprenticeships and whether or not we should be looking at that as a way to provide skills both to traditional and non-traditional workers. Do you have a view on the German model?
Yeah, I think, again, you sort of, from a political standpoint, you ask yourself how far in that direction, American elected politics will let you go, because, of course, what's the label that's going to be thrown at me for the next 60 days, right? That you're sort of some European-style socialist something, and of course what they mean is France, Germany. And so there are limits to how far I think we can go politically. But the answer is Germany has some amazing apprenticeship programs. They have some very innovative programs whereby if there is a recession, workers can work a half day instead of a full day, which allows them to keep their jobs, even if at a reduced rate. In this country, of course, you lose your job. So why not do what Germany does and allow workers to, in the face of a recession, work a half day? That's some pain and suffering, but a lot less than if you lose your job. We could learn a lot from Germany within, I think, the bounds of our slightly rightward shifted politics.
Got it. You mentioned technology, you mentioned globalization. Obviously, the change in business structures, it's led to the increase in the number of independent workers that we have, are all ways that work is changing. I'm curious to ask, like, as you look at those factors and those trends, kind of how you assess those three independently. What do you really think is going to potentially drive change over the next 5 to 10 years in terms of, I mean, as you mentioned, technology, it sounds like you're a believer that self-driving cars are going to be here sooner rather than later. It's going to have an impact on work. It sounds like you believe globalization is going to continue to have an impact on work as well. And I guess this last category that we're talking about in terms of independent work, right, where we're seeing more people who are working to earn supplemental income, picking up gigs on the side in addition to their main source of income. How do you assess, especially that last piece, in terms of whether or not you think directionally you think that's going to increase over time, stay where it is, or do you think that we've seen as much kind of a movement towards independent work as we're going to see?
I think we have barely begun to see the effects of what's coming. I am not a tech guy, but I know enough AI people to know that what's coming is probably close to unimaginable right now. And what I mean by that is, I don't think there's a profession, maybe other than my own, and maybe some very kind of creative professions that will not be touched, changed, maybe eliminated by technology in the coming generation. A lot of what we do, so it used to be that routine jobs were taken out by automation. Pretty soon, any job that is not about learning and adapting and thinking around difficult problems is going to largely go away. I was a banker for a while. In 1990, when I was a banker, I spent most of my days and nights, pulling numbers out of financial disclosure. That is all automated. Medicine and law are going to see dramatic changes, because at the end of the day, the law is a finite set of information. Medical treatments, that's a finite set of diagnostic tools and therapies and all that stuff. So I think just about everything is going to get disrupted, and the implications for the individual are, and for us, again, this model that I get a degree and now I get to work for 30 years because I have this degree. More and more it's going to be, do you have this skill that we didn't even imagine 5 years ago? Geez, how do I get this skill? I want to mention my friend Byron Auguste. He's been really helpful to us. That's a name that'll be familiar to some people in the room. He's encouraging us through his organization to get off the certifications and to get onto the specific set of words in the resume and onto what are your actual skills and can you do the job posted. So I think it's more speed, it's more learning, and it's more flexibility around the kinds of skills that people have.
Let me ask you, you gave us a good example from your own family about the social contract that existed in the 20th century, and your parents and grandparents worked for one employer. They had an employer that provided them health care and retirement. I want to maybe tease this out a little bit. You were kind of suggesting, hey, now in the 21st century, there are a different set of benefits that workers need. And you think you mentioned childcare. I was wondering if you could expand upon where you see benefits and protections that actually align well with the way work is changing. Do you have any? You mentioned childcare, but I'm curious if paid leave and sick leave and other benefits that provide flexibility in this economy are things that you're thinking about as you're considering portable benefits and solutions in that area.
Yeah, I'd like to answer that question with an unequivocal yes. Yes, I know all the answers. I know what it's going to look like, and we're working on them. First of all, I don't, because it's not even clear to me what the nature of the problem is. Second, and I hopefully alluded to this successfully, it's really not clear to me that the federal government should figure out this stuff. Now I'm way out over my skis. I do know, partly because I have kids, but I do know that we're going to think about childcare radically, or already are thinking about childcare radically differently than we did when, in this country in the 1950s, mom stayed home with the kids. Today, most intact father-mother families, both parents are working. I'm not sure that's a federal problem to be solved. I love the idea of communities, medium-sized cities, thinking about, hey, we're a community. we've got people who are underemployed. How can we take people who are underemployed and, put them together in a way that they help people who are overemployed with things like childcare? So, no, I don't know what those answers are, and I'm pretty sure that they're not all federal, and that we got to figure out a way. And this points to something that we New Democrats are very intrigued by. How do we create enough room in the regulatory environment? Now I'm starting to sound a little bit like my friends on the other side of the aisle, but how do we create enough room in the regulatory environment for people to try stuff, either around childcare or around, hey, if some company thinks of some really cool, innovative retirement plan or healthcare plan, can we give them the room to experiment? Presumably not, putting their employees at risk, but in ways that can prove out innovative ideas.
Okay, so I'll have two more questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience to see if they have any questions for the congressman. I'll ask you a political question, and you kind of touched on it a bit in your remarks. The House is not known as the most bipartisan place. Washington is not particularly known right now as a bipartisan place, but you are the head of the New Dems, which is known as a bipartisan organization. I'm kind of curious to get your assessment as we head into 2019, again, in a set of issues that are, as you mentioned, kind of complex and difficult, but don't necessarily now have like a partisan, there's not a Republican position on the future of work and a Democratic position on the future of work. I'm kind of curious, how do you assess the politics and the likelihood that there will be bipartisan opportunities in this space?
Big question. So I think there's a structural change that has to happen in our politics to give the center some breathing room. Right now, most members of Congress, most senators, more so on the House side, fear their primary electorate. Talk to Joe Crowley or Mike Capuano. Now, that's two guys out of a caucus of 180 or whatever we've got in the House. So it's not like this is a fear that everybody has. But the point is, we got to figure out a better way to get representatives to truly represent their population rather than their primary electorate. And look, I like my primary electorate, but the point is that look, you all saw Mitt Romney and Hillary Clinton run for president. They became radically different people when they ran for president because they had to appeal to their primary electorates. Mitt Romney went from being a liberal Republican governor of Massachusetts to being something very, very different. And Hillary Clinton, after spending her career on Trans-Pacific Partnership, threw it under the bus. So, if you look at what California has done, there are ways to introduce more moderate, more universal inputs into who gets to be a candidate. And I start there. That gets boring fast, but I start there because if you do that, it bubbles up into two caucuses that have more center of gravity around a more practical way of thinking. I think the Republicans and the Democrats have their own challenges. Don't listen to me on Republicans, but I'll give you my diagnosis. They need to get over Donald Trump. I think they will start to do that in November. And what I mean by that is look, I'm not a Republican, but I very much respect what they were. There needs to be an instinct around fiscal responsibility, around individual liberty, around limited government. We need that. That's not who they are today. So they need to do that and then get back to what they were. And then I think they need to be asked one interesting question, which is, hey, we agree this problem is out here. Is the free market going to address it fast enough? My answer to that is not by a generation or two. On the Democratic side, in order to be fair with my diagnoses, we need to be more open-minded about innovation. So yes, by all means, let's defend Social Security and Medicare. They are remarkable accomplishments, and no, Social Security is not a Ponzi scheme. But let's think about how they can be updated and innovated in ways. Let's have that conversation without you pointing at me and saying, I want to do away with Social Security, so now I lose my next primary election. So again, I think there's homework on both sides of the aisle that get us to a place where we can have a more practical discussion about this stuff.
I'll ask one last question, then I'll invite the audience to ask questions as well. You mentioned labor. They're obviously, as you mentioned, representing a historically low number of private sector workers. You mentioned the importance, though, of having labor kind of be part of the solution. I'm curious if you could expand a bit on kind of where you see labor being part of the set of answers around the future of work, and especially as it relates to independent workers.
Yeah, what I just said about the Democrats, I would say to labor too, which is like every other institution, you've got to evolve and adapt. And so in terms of, and if you had a Republican up here, they would probably disagree, but there's no question that power structures will exacerbate the natural flow of money to capital and away from labor. We don't need to go too far down that, but that's a natural thing. And so for 100 years, the labor movement said, hey, you can't forget us. Two things happened. One, starting with the presidency of Ronald Reagan, maybe before, Washington, particularly under the control of Republicans, made a very deliberate effort to weaken labor. And the middle class has paid the price for that. Okay, that's a little slash at my friends on the other side of the aisle. I would also say what I just said, which is that labor, I think, needs to really think to themselves, we're in a very different world than we were in the 1920s. We are now competing globally, and we want our employers to succeed and to compete well. So how do we demand what we deserve, but also think about training, think about quality? And by the way, they're doing this in my district. There's all sorts of apprenticeship programs, but how do we really move in that direction of saying, you have to pay us this and give us this because we are unquestionably worth it. We train, we provide the quality, we provide the consistency. I think that's probably the conversation that needs to happen there.
Okay, well, I open it up. Questions in the audience. I'm just going to do it as I see people. So right now, right there.
Yeah. Hi, my name is...
You want to use the microphone?
Yeah.
And please identify your name and organization,
Sure.
please.
My name is Wenqi Yu. So I work for VIP Kid, which is now the world's largest education technology company. It's a platform company connecting teachers from North America with kids from Asia. So we have about 70,000 teachers now teaching on our platform, about 350 from Connecticut. So my question is, for a platform company like ours, we really care about quality, as you were talking about. So we really want to provide training to teachers to help them teach online, to help them get certification and all these other things. But our current legislative environment, because it's so outdated, it treats independent workers as a way that really restricts what business can do with them. And I understand the intention was, not to control them, but helping them to actually gain more skills, right, and provide a lot more additional kind of support actually becomes a difficulty. I guess this is kind of in the weeds, but the bigger question really is, our current legislative or legal environment seems outdated to really handle innovative companies like many of the platform companies, and they're all independent workers. So in your view, over the next few years, in addition to the benefits related issues, will there be any real legislative or policy innovation that would allow us to actually thrive and provide better opportunities for American workers?
Yeah, great question. I describe myself as out over my skis a little bit on issues of training and education. Just I don't have a ton of expertise. And part of the reason for that is the federal government is of all the areas we're talking about, the federal government is not going to be the area of experimentation probably in the educational realm. Why? Because as you know, really pre-secondary education is in the realm of the states and municipalities. That's the good news and the bad news. Because individual states and individual cities and towns and counties have the ability to do their thing, hopefully they'll do their thing in creative ways. I also would hope, and I see in the post-secondary world, at least the universities starting to think about some of the questions I asked up here, which is why must a university be a geographic location? What's magic about 4 years? So I think a lot of the innovation there is going to happen because people like you go to the state of Minneapolis and say, hey, we've got this great idea, let us pilot it and see how it works. In some ways, the way the educational reform charter school movement has worked. Let us try it and let's see what the results are. But I'll tell you another personal story that really points, you'll get a kick out of this. So I get put on the Intelligence Committee 5-6 years ago, and I get made ranking member of the Cybersecurity and NSA subcommittee, and I realized as I start this that I actually don't really understand encryption. Right? So how does encryption and the math around? So you know how I learned encryption? I went on Khan Academy. I kid you not, right? You know, I get so now. Fortunately, I didn't have to get a certificate or anything. So my point is that it actually started me on the path exactly right, and it was pretty easy to do. And so I had that experience of getting a really good, and somebody could have stuck a mic in my face and asked me a question about encryption. I would have looked pretty stupid. But anyway, in my own experience, there's just opportunities to get smart quickly through things that didn't exist 20 years ago.
Yeah, and I'll just add for 20 seconds that you do have states like Washington State that have portable benefit legislation that's been introduced in multiple terms now that Uber and SEIU have agreed to work on together. So it's an interesting alliance of labor and business, where again, employers are making contributions into an account that will provide benefits to independent contractors. So we'll see where those models potentially take us. And I think we'll potentially see more innovation at the state level, assuming the congressman is right, then we'll see at the federal level in the short term. Other questions? Yes.
Hi, Debbie. Sorry. Hi, Debbie Chalfie with AARP. I'm intrigued, we're all intrigued by the notion of creating additional ways for people to be able to save for retirement. But I think the data is showing that even the 401k system is not really working for employers and employees in the sense that only about half of the workforce has access to those kinds of plans. And even when they do, they're not able to save nearly enough for retirement. I think the data shows something like the median retirement account for near retirees, something like $14,000. So if you can't save...
Can I pause you for 1 second just to switch out your microphone? For some reason, you're cutting in and out.
So sorry.
Sorry. If the retirement savings system is not necessarily working all that well for employers and employees, where there's an established structure and a contribution from an employer, why do we think some sort of portable do-it-yourself retirement savings program is going to work at all, or certainly any better?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's some areas in which we know we can make it work better, easy problems to solve. If you look at the data out there between the world that exists today where you have to opt in to a 401k versus if you have to opt out, behavioral economists love this stuff, right? Turns out that you get like a 25, 30% uptick if you just change the opt-in, opt-out. So there's some easy problems to solve. And then there's some really hard problems to solve, like the fact that most Americans aren't in a position to save enough for their retirement. In some ways, what we're talking about here, the very name of this conference is trying to solve that problem, right? How do we put more workers in a position to have the income to save? And don't get me wrong, particularly given where you come from, this is not the idea behind these portable retirement accounts is not to replace Social Security. I'm hoping, it's like 401ks and IRAs. It's designed to sit on top of Social Security and hopefully take some of the pressure off Social Security, because as you know better than I know, Social Security was never really intended to be America's retirement plan. It was designed in the 30s to keep elderly people from being dirt poor. And if we can do this right, again, by solving some of the easier problems to solve and some of the harder problems to solve, it will result in hopefully some of the pressure being taken off Social Security.
So I think we have time for one last question before we switch over to the panel. Yes, right in front.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Andrew Greenblatt. I'm the head of IDG Benefits Fund. I think I got the bad one. That's the good one.
We can hear you up here.
I'll do my best. So
everything I said about technology actually taking over the world, I take it back now. We can't even get microphones.
We could use some of it here. So our organization is using surcharges placed on Uber rides to give benefits directly to rideshare drivers like Uber drivers. From that comes my question, which is these drivers that we are working with, they don't have any money for retirement. They don't have any money for buying benefits. The problem isn't a legislative one. It's dollars and cents. So it's not that they filled up their Roth IRA and now what are they going to do? The law standing in their way. They don't have a penny for retirement. It's not that, they wish they could buy some disability insurance. They don't have any money for disability insurance. So you would start off by saying, look, I don't think government should get into funding this, and the private sector is going to somehow have to step in and solve this problem. But rideshare is a perfect example of, they've abdicated themselves from all of this on purpose because it saves them a ton of money. So the private sector doesn't want in. If government doesn't want to fund this, the worker doesn't have any money to fund this, who's going to pay for all of this? So if the government's not going to step in and require some funding for this, where's the money going to come from?
Yeah, that's a huge question, and I wouldn't be categorical and say government's not going to fund this. Let me go back to the one thing that I mentioned that actually did happen, the Affordable Care Act, right? The Affordable Care Act said, we're going to make healthcare available to a lot more people and affordable to a lot more people. How do we do that? We subsidize those people. How do we pay for that? By raising the limit on the Medicare charge on people who have in excess of $250,000 in income. That's actually a pretty good model for how you can make these benefits more pervasive from a government standpoint. I'm all in favor if Uber, and I think Uber is working, as I understand it, with SEIU and others, maybe in the Northwest, on trying to come up with models to do this. I think they should be pushed to do so. I love innovation, so I don't want to push them so hard that they go out of business. But yeah, by all means, let's push them to be more. I mean, they would object to the categorization of employers, obviously, but let's push them to be good citizens, and let's also be efficient about it. Again, it's a little bit like the last question. The problem. We will always have a bottom quarter of the income. I mean, as a matter of mathematics, we will always have a bottom quarter of the income distribution that we will, some way, shape, or form, call poor. And that's a bigger problem to solve than the problems that we're thinking about in this room, about how to make benefits and the safety net more efficient, more modernized. So just because we're focused on this stuff doesn't mean, gosh, we're always going to leave some people behind. And what do we, as the richest country in the world, owe to those people? So I'm not saying that we should abandon the instinct of saying we can do more by our most vulnerable, or the people who are being left behind. The New Democrat in me just says, let's figure out what government should do there, which is, in my opinion, no American should be hungry. No American should have not have access to health care. Let's figure out how government can guarantee that, and let's figure out how the private sector most efficiently contributes to that mission, and how they can be efficient about providing the benefits that they do provide, conscious as we are that that won't be available, that their benefits out of the private sector won't necessarily be available to everybody.
Okay, I think we're going to have to call it there. Thank you to the Congressman for joining us today and sharing his thoughts and remarks. We're going to transition to our panel. I think we're going to have people come around and collect note cards. So if you have a question that you want to ask the panel just based on where we are now, Connor is there, Ethan is there, please hand the note cards to them, and then we'll move to the next stage of this event. So again, thanks again, Congressman.
Thanks,
Pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
Is this your water?
Okay. I'm Yuki Noguchi. I'm with NPR, and thank you guys so much for coming. And we've got a lot of panelists with different perspectives here to share their views on financial security for contractors, which, as we heard, is a very growing environment. One of the things I want, sort of in terms of like how we're going to set up this discussion, I think we're going to sort of first talk about some of the problems and challenges that contractors sort of face. And we'll go through that fairly quickly because I think that's probably doesn't need as much explanation. But then I think we want to talk a little bit about some of the policy proposals and other programs and what stage those are in and sort of what we're learning from them, any challenges that we're learning from in the implementation of those programs or policies. So really quickly, I think we'll just do a quick rundown from you, David.
Sure. I'm David Mitchell. I'm Associate Director for Policy and Market Solutions with the Aspen Institute Financial Security Program. So it's a close relative of the Future of Work initiative, share a lot of the same goals of expanding economic security for vulnerable workers. We're focused particularly on financial challenges, so both short-term stability issues. We've done a lot of work on income volatility that came up in the Congressman's remarks, as well as long-term asset building like retirement policy and home ownership and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. I'm Shelley Stewart with the Aspen Institute Future of Work Initiative. And as Al mentioned and described in his opening remarks, we look at developing creative policy solutions for the challenges faced by a changing workforce and ensuring that all workers have access to a safety net as we move into the 21st century.
Great.
Hi everyone, my name is Kosar. I'm the Director of Impact at Sama School. We're a nonprofit organization that provides training for low-income job seekers and workers on how to utilize opportunities that are provided through the independent workforce. And we provide direct training services, so we're on the ground directly working with low-income, like I said, job seekers and workers.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Duke Chang. I'm the co-founder and head of Be Solo. I wanted to thank the Aspen Institute for collaborating with us on this event today. It's a very important topic. And I appreciate the Congressman's opening remarks, too, about the role of private enterprise in finding solutions to some of these great problems. That's what we're here for. Our mission at Be Solo is to help unleash the benefits of independent life without compromise. And that without compromise piece is really important because that's what we see happening right now. There are obstacles, there are challenges, there are hassles that are getting away from the people who have chosen this independent lifestyle to be able to be really successful at what they do.
Hi, my name is Sarah Bailey. I am representing, not fully in any capacity, some of the millions of self-employed people in the United States. I've been self-employed for 6 years. I don't think for the purpose of this panel it's necessary to really know what it is I do, but for the sake of transparency, I'm an independent consultant on humanitarian assistance, and I would classify myself in being in the higher income as opposed to lower income self-employed people, which I think is quite important to point out because these challenges are a bit different, or the exposure to those challenges are a bit different.
So, I think the Congressman talked a little bit about some of the problems and challenges that people face. I sort of wrote down a cursory list here. There are problems with saving, and particularly saving for emergencies that comes up for freelancers or contractors. There's a problem of taxes, managing your taxes, which the Congressman also discussed. We could talk about insurance and, the dilemma of what to pay for, what not to pay for, what kind of insurance to get. And then, healthcare obviously being probably the biggest component of that. And then there's the issue of income stability, the idea that contractors kind of have to manage, they're a one-man show, they're their own payroll department, their own HR, they're everything. And then, as Sarah sort of referenced, there are differences between low-wage workers and high-wage workers in terms of the issues that they face. But I thought that maybe we could start with Duke a little bit, because you have actual data about what kinds of challenges people face, financially. And so what do you see in terms of, at Be Solo, what kinds of issues do people run into? Maybe you can text through like the top three.
Yeah, so thank you for that. We've conducted research over thousands of people who work for themselves or are self-employed, and we've conducted in-person interviews with hundreds of them. And this is what we've learned is, for those people who are in the traditional workforce, we often talk about this idea of work and life and a work-life balance, and there's sort of these two things. There are, for freelancers, two other circles, if you can imagine, between work and life. One of them we call the jobs of the job. So as you alluded to, When you go freelance, it's not that you have to deliver the work that you get paid for, but all of a sudden, you're your own HR department, your own marketing department, and everything else. You have to do all these other jobs that the firm used to provide to you that are now your responsibility, and those create financial complexities and financial burdens. And then outside of that, between that and life itself, is this what we call the jobs of life. So finding healthcare, finding other protections, finding childcare, as the congressman talked about. All these are other things that there was infrastructure in place when you work for a firm to help you with those things that you are also now on your own to go find. So you can think about it as kind of concentric rings. So if I got to deliver my job, I've got to then do the jobs of the job, and then I got to do the jobs of life before I can actually live my life.
And so where do people tend to get tripped up? Where is it on the emergency savings? Is it on insurance issues and having a catastrophic health event? Where do you see things falling apart?
Yeah, so a couple of things there. Taxes has been brought up quite a bit. And what we find in our research is that's not the first thing on somebody's mind when they decide to go and work for themselves. Oftentimes, they don't even find out about the need to pay quarterly taxes, as was described at the beginning of this program, until they hit that first year. And then all of a sudden, there's this huge shock of, oh my gosh, not only have I not been paying taxes properly, I'm probably getting hit with a penalty on the taxes I didn't pay. And I don't really have a system of understanding how to deal with that. One of my favorite quotes from one of the interviews that we conducted was from this person who said, look, I'm a native American, I'm an native English speaker, I consider myself pretty smart, I have an advanced degree, and I'm so frustrated because I cannot figure out how to do the right thing here. I want to do the right thing, I want to make sure I pay my taxes, but it's so complex, I just can't figure it out.
Mm-hmm. So that's like one of the top things.
I think that's one of the tax things. Certainly healthcare has been touched upon, and access to healthcare, access to a lot of the other protections that are difficult to get when you are self-employed, that then cause you to need to have a bigger emergency fund because you're essentially self-insuring yourself.
Right, right. So we'll get to sort of Shelley's tax proposal sort of in terms of like delving into what potential policy solutions might be on the tax front. But maybe, Sarah, you could talk a little bit about what surprised you when you became a contractor 6 years ago, financially speaking. What were the issues that you ran into, and were they surprising to you?
Yeah, it was very surprising, and it's exactly what Duke mentioned. I became one of the people that actually didn't realize that the quarterly tax system existed because I'd become self-employed in the United Kingdom, where you register to be self-employed. It's quite straightforward. And I also wasn't aware about essentially the double taxation, and I realize some people don't call it that, but because employers pay half of Social Security and Medicare and employees pay half of Social Security and Medicare, when you're self-employed, you face the full burden of that. So you actually pay more taxes. So I wasn't setting enough aside for taxes. I ended up with about a $10,000 difference, which is really surprising when that happens to you. I was also not necessarily paying my quarterly taxes because I'd moved from the United Kingdom and that was less of one. But these actually catch up to you much later. By the time you realize it, you're already into the next tax year, and you've already kind of continued that poor practice. Since then, I have overpaid my taxes, resulting in very limited cash flow. I just happened to be advancing a plane ticket to Uganda if, God willing, I can get out of North Carolina tomorrow. So you have to sometimes advance your own expenses. So I have limited tax flow from having overpaid my quarterly taxes last year while I'm also advancing my own expenses, which will be reimbursed. And that money is there for the federal government, but it makes it very tight. And if this is happening to me when I consider myself pretty educated and trying to do the right thing, and also with a bit of a marginal higher income than some others who may be at the lower scale of this, then I just can only imagine what these challenges are like for others.
So do you rely on like software now that you didn't use before to do this? Like what do you actually rely on to manage the flow of funds and to know, have visibility into both the future and your taxes?
I'll be honest, I'm thinking about checking out this product, bSolo for simplifying taxes. The only reason I haven't is because I currently don't owe the federal government anything because I overpaid it. But I keep accounts separate. I have a separate account for my work, and I am now setting aside, and this sounds incredible to me. 55% of every paycheck that I get to be able to cover my health insurance, to be able to put aside a bit for retirement, and to be able to have enough for taxes. When I had started, I was doing 35%. And over about a year period, that's how I ended up essentially a bit in debt. So those expenses really add up, especially $450 a month for health insurance.
So Kosar, maybe you could talk a little bit from the low-income workers' perspective. First of all, what kinds of jobs do you see going to contractor in the low-income sphere? And Sarah talked about setting aside more of her income, but if you can't actually pay your bills, or if it's right on the margin, I imagine you don't actually have that kind of flexibility. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the challenges that you see.
Yeah, so a lot of our trainees are actually folks who've entered the workforce development system, so they're getting some sort of workforce training program through a community-based organization, through a city program. And we focus on industries and organizations that actually can tap into gig work. So right now that's looking like IT is predominantly one of our very large industry verticals, if you want to call it, and then home health care, and obviously driving because the barrier to entry is so low. And for those folks, essentially what's happening is a lot of them are either upskilling or they've been chronically unemployed, so they're trying to enter the workforce in a different way, not just transitioning from their sort of W-2, from their classification as a W-2 employer to someone who's doing the same set of tasks as an independent contractor. So they're facing a lot of different challenges as they're trying to do gig work, and a lot of it has to do with, do they have the right technical skills and confidence, because they don't have the support of being in an institution. If they don't have the skills, they're alone on these contracts that they're doing. So as an example, to make it really concrete, we have folks who are getting their IT certification, and they'll go out for a chain store, for example, and get a contract to go and set up Wi-Fi networks and different types of networks at each of their retail locations. So they'll get a contract for each of those locations. And typically they're alone, so that's where the self-confidence piece comes in. In terms of challenges, on the flip side of sort of what Sarah's talking about, a lot of the folks that we are training are also receiving some sort of public assistance, and they have a huge mental block about trying gig work, even though it can reconnect them to work in a relatively quicker time than other training programs, because they're afraid that if they exceed a certain income threshold, they won't receive their benefits, which is true. In most states, if you exceed, it's very strict. And we don't have the resources to do that individual calculation, and there isn't like an easily accessible tool where you can go in and sort of really quickly figure out how much am I making now, and how much do I have until I get through to that threshold. So even though we think that there are a lot of downsides to gig work, but there are a lot of upsides depending on where you are in your career, there's some folks who sort of have that mental block because they're afraid that the thing that's floating them right now at that time will be pulled out from under them. So that's one of the sort of, from a policy perspective, one of the things we advocate for is folks who are going in between employment transitions should be able to have some sort of security in terms of assistance. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about policy proposals, and from the questions from the audience, I mean, there is some question about sort of how much of this can be addressed in the current system, which is binary. You're either an employee and you get certain benefits, or you don't. So I just want to throw that out there as something that maybe you guys could address. But in terms of policy proposals, maybe we can take the tax issue, and Shelley, you can talk briefly about sort of why you think these tax proposals work, and maybe whether there are states or municipalities that are trying some tax proposals. What are they trying to address, and how are they working? Sorry, that's a big question, but what can you tell us about what needs to be addressed on the tax front to sort of even out and make more predictable this whole system?
Yeah, so much of the tax filing system, like a lot of the policies we're talking about, retirement benefits, were designed for a very particular type of employer-employee relationship. And I'd push back that it's really just a binary. You're either an independent worker or an employee, because it's a particular understanding of employment that these systems were created for, where you have a permanent full-time job for a long time with a particular employer, and that has shifted. There's independent workers. There's also just lower quality traditional W-2 jobs that lack benefits, that lack access to a lot of these things. On the tax issue, so we released our issue brief this morning that focuses on the independent contractors specifically. So these are people receiving 1099s, and we recommend 3 provisions to alleviate some of the challenges that Duke and Sarah highlighted. So one of these is just increasing the reporting required by companies hiring 1099 contractors. So right now there's actually 2 different thresholds depending on how the workers are paid, which is confusing in itself. I won't get into it here, but check out the issue brief if you're interested in that. But we recommend just evening it out. So all 1099 workers, regardless of how they are paid, get a documentation of their earnings each year if they make more than $600.
And what is that threshold currently?
For those paid through what's called a third-party network, and this includes most online platforms, it's not until $20,000. So there's a huge number of workers who are making under $20,000, but still owing taxes.
And so how does that help the worker sort of even out their taxes? Like if the well, we're calling it an employer, they're not an employer, but if the person paying the bills or the gig company reports this, then how does that help in turn the worker sort of smooth out their income?
Yeah, so it provides the documentation of their earnings. So they are not needing for tax purposes to necessarily track every amount that they're making. It doesn't help with the fluctuations. The fluctuations are still there, but when it comes time to file taxes, and if you look at this provision on its own, although it's part of a suite of provisions, it does aid then with the estimation of taxes.
And would that help you, Sarah?
I'm a very unique case because most of my clients are overseas. So I've actually never received any money from a US client and therefore rely completely on self-reporting. But I think having options are important. It's extremely difficult, oddly, to prove how much money you make as a self-employed person, which, I mean, buying a house I know is something that not everyone can do, but there shouldn't be more of a burden to doing that if you're a self-employed person than if you're employed. And it is extraordinarily difficult if you have been self-employed for less than 2 years, or if you're not able to just scan a PDF document that says, I made this much money. And I think I was incredibly lucky to have just gotten a bank transfer that corresponded to an invoice amount that the bank believed me on this. Because if it had been even 2 months earlier, asking for the previous 3 months of income, I would not have been able to do that, and I wouldn't be a homeowner now. So,
right.
Yeah.
Other tax issues that you think that these proposals would address?
So the second provision is withholding for independent contractors. So a traditional W-2 employee, their employer takes the taxes out before the worker ever gets the paycheck. It's sent to the Treasury Department. 75% of workers then get a refund when they file, rather than this system of having to pay in every couple of months based on estimated income. So we recommend a system of withholding for independent contractors, aligning their tax experience more with traditional workers. And then the last provision is a standard business deduction. So it's an alternative to itemizing business expenses to deduct them, comparable to the personal standard deduction of, we recommend 20%.
So these proposals would essentially sort of streamline the process of data gathering and the burden on the individual worker so that they can file the taxes quicker, easier, with more predictability.
Right? Exactly. It makes the process a lot less burdensome on the taxpayer and increases compliance for government.
Right. Okay. David, can you talk a little bit about, we talked about portable benefits, for example, or other interesting programs that might sort of help, that are being talked about around the country that you have your eyes on in terms of, lessons learned, things that you think are successful or that you're particularly excited about?
Sure. Yeah, so I think first I'd like to echo Shelley's point, which is there's actually a lot of convergence, I think, within the independent worker demographic and the low-wage traditional, W-2 worker demographic. And so the best solution, to my mind, kind of bridge that gap and provide help to all of the vulnerable workers who need financial security. And in fact, we know also from data and research that there's a lot of overlap between the people who are in the W-2 workforce, but then on the side also might have gigs or other independent work. So I think we do need to keep that in mind. In terms of short-term stability, so cash flow issues around predictability of hours, predictability of pay, I think there's interesting proposals out there that have to do with predictable scheduling, for example. And again, that's mostly on the W-2 side, but could be applied to contingent workers as well.
Can you talk about how that would affect the contingent workforce?
Yeah, sure.
Potentially, like, I mean, not that there are specific proposals, as I gather, out there, but how would that help?
Well, I guess related to predictable scheduling, it's kind of just a predictable cash flow, right? Access to already earned pay. And so in the private sector, there's products that are being piloted in certain jurisdictions around just giving both W-2 and contingent workers access to their pay more immediately, right? So I think Uber drivers and Lyft drivers already have this option that they can get paid. It doesn't have to be the second Friday of the month. They can just get the money now, which is not going to change their economic situation entirely, but it could mean the difference between making a bill payment early or late, or having to rely on a payday loan, something like that. And on the long-term kind of asset building side, something that we're watching pretty carefully are state-initiated retirement plans. So basically, it's a little bit in the ACA model of the state comes in and builds either an exchange for small business owners to go and provide retirement plans for their workers, or contingent workers, independent workers can go on their own and find kind of a one-stop shop for where they can get those benefits. Or in some cases, states themselves are actually going to be running these pooled IRA programs. Oregon is one who recently announced that they will be allowing contingent workers, independent workers, to go into those programs as well. So you don't actually need an employer to be setting that up for you. You can very easily do it on your own.
And has Oregon launched their program?
Oregon has launched their Oregon Saves program. I don't believe that independent workers are yet able to access it because they're gradually putting it out, implementing it, but they have recently announced that they will be eligible.
And then, New York, when you talked about sort of the ability to collect the income sooner, I mean, this is an issue that I've heard a lot from contract workers, is like non-payment and chasing payment, and the predictability of getting the person, the person or the people that you work for to pay you. And in New York, instituted legislation, I think it was maybe a year and a half ago, so increasing the fines and the penalties for companies that don't pay their contractors. Do you know if that's made a difference in terms of people's income stability for contractors?
That's a great question. I do not know the answer to that. I'm not sure if anybody's done an analysis of that yet. But right, you would imagine that kind of enforcing those rules more stringently would help independent contractors have access to their pay on a speedy basis. Yeah.
And do you think that COSAR is that an issue that comes up with particularly low-wage workers who may not have as much of a margin to work with? Do they have difficulty sort of getting payment on time?
I think for our demographic and the type of work that they're doing, it's less of an issue. But as they go further up into sort of contracts that are longer over time, we do see that. But right now, the survey data that we have, it doesn't rank as one of their top issues. There's a very low percentage of trainees that say they've had to deal with an employer basically, or a client that hasn't paid them.
Okay. One of the things, you guys talked about, sort of the law treats people as either employed or contractor. But as you mentioned, there are W-2 workers who don't make much money or don't get many benefits, and so they find themselves straddling these two worlds. And so some of the questions that we're getting from the audience is, is there a move either, I guess, locally, because federally not much is moving, but I mean, how do you guys see that playing out in terms of creating, I mean, there's talk of a third way for independent contractors. Some people say it shouldn't be just a third way, that there should be more of a flexible. I'm throwing this out to the whole panel about what you think that classification is going to look like, and how, where do you see the most interesting sort of policy proposals that you think address as many of the issues, the most comprehensively this question of, how do you move into a non-binary world? Anyone
Sure,
want to take it?
I can start. I'm not going to take a strong position on how the labor classification system should work going forward. That's a little bit, I'll be a little bit in front of my skis, as the congressman said. But I do think it's an example of we need to be careful, right? Because how you set those rules will have kind of domino effects for many generations to come, and we've kind of seen that with some of the current regulatory systems that we're trying to work through. So in the retirement space, ERISA is one that regulates how retirement plans are being offered from employers, and it really doesn't envision anybody but an employer providing that benefit. And now we're in this new world where we could imagine payroll providers or gig platforms providing those benefits, and we're kind of stuck in this regulatory space, which the congressman alluded to. So I would just say, a little bit punting on the actual classification question, but that we need to have flexibility in those regulations so that as the economy changes for the next generation, we're not tied down to some anachronistic system.
Can you talk a little bit about the Washington State proposals and how that, what that is and what they're proposing, and what issues you think that it might address and what it might not?
Shelley, do you want to?
Shelley?
Yeah.
Sure. And I think I'll sort of tie that question in with what David was saying, is that there's a lot of space here, as Congressman Himes was talking about, for innovation to figure out exactly what types of policies and programs we would want. And we can think about those not necessarily in terms of contractor versus employee, but what is a type of program that improves and enhances the safety net for workers across arrangements. And with that, there's a lot of really difficult questions, because so many of the policies historically have been bound up in things like classification. But you look at Washington State, which has now introduced portable benefits legislation for the past 2 sessions. It's now kind of on pause to bring stakeholders together and have really important questions, like what does the system actually look like? Some of the questions that came up earlier, like who funds this? Where are contributions coming from? To what extent do employers and entities hiring contractors pay in? How much is the individual? How much is the government? These are the types of questions that need to be answered to really move forward. And Washington State is having a lot of those conversations, and will be an exciting place to watch as things move forward.
And I wonder, if you talk a little bit like the models. I did a story about the Black Car Fund in New York, which is an interesting model where companies like Uber, most of the sort of black car drivers, drivers for hire, the companies will pay in a certain percentage to the Black Car Fund, which has sort of expanded from just offering benefits like accident.
Workers' compensation.
Workers' compensation, thank you. To venturing out into some telemedicine benefits and death benefits for families. Do you think that is the model that a lot of states and municipalities are looking at still, or are there sort of limitations about that program that make it difficult to apply across many industries?
I think there's a lot of potential in that program, a lot of success and a lot to learn from. There's also other examples. Recently launched ALIA from the National Domestic Workers Alliance as a platform that sort of facilitates the connection of home care clients paying directly into a benefits fund that then domestic workers can benefit from. So you have kind of these different models, and what's important about them from a broader scalability perspective is not any one of these examples, but the fact that there's experimentation happening, that people are looking into what does and doesn't work, and what might we be able to learn from, say, Black Car Fund that's translatable to other occupations, other industries, that could be extended across industries.
Yuki, I think one of the important things here is policy will define what is allowable, But at the end of the day, behind all these numbers and statistics, there's human beings who are doing the jobs here and who are being impacted by this. And so it really drives down to behavior. And so some of these programs and initiatives are designed to help drive systems of behavior, right? The congressman talked a little bit about retirement from the AARP question. Like, I can put a little bit more color and numbers to that. We know from the data that when an employer who has a 401k does choose to have an auto-enroll feature, the participation rate in that is about 87%, versus when it's an opt-in and the employee has to select themselves, it's only about 52%. That drives behavior. We know that 91% of the people who who are auto-enrolled stick into that auto-enroll program. These are systems that are in place for the W-2 workforce to drive automated behavior, because the behavior is what's hard. These things are not fun things to deal with. Taxes aren't fun to deal with. They are a hassle, they are a headache, they are a cognitive load. So to the extent that we can drive sort of behavioral mechanics to help people do the things that we think they're necessary in order to be financially successful, I think overall we'll be more successful.
Yeah, I mean, I think, to your point, it's interesting because I did the story in the Black Car Fund, and then I got into a cab, and I asked my cab driver, do you know that you're covered by the Black Car Fund? No idea. What are you talking about? What is this? That's great. But like, this is one of their challenges is, they don't, is marketing themselves. I mean, this is a benefit that exists that, somebody may, an Uber driver could easily just overlook, not realize they're covered. So that's sort of an interesting point.
I mean, nobody ever thinks about payroll as a benefit, right? But think about all the things that happen in that payroll moment. You get your taxes taken care of for you. You get your insurance taken care of for you. You get your Social Security, Medicare. All that stuff is taken care of for you. You may have access to benefits through that payroll mechanism. That doesn't exist to drive that behavior for freelancers.
Right. There's a question I think that's sort of related. I want to sort of pivot to sort of training, because one of the aspects that sort of strikes me is just what you said. There's a certain, you have an employer, all these aspects of your job and your finances are taken care of for you to some extent, so that you're in compliance. But you're a one-man show when you're a contractor, and you may or may not have the training or education to really even know what you have to do. So the question here is, why don't more companies train people to do the jobs they're hiring for? What can be done to increase job training provided and paid for by private employers? I think, just maybe, Kosar, you could talk a little bit about, how you guys think about education for this new workforce and how you reach people and get them to understand even the universe of things that they have to do, and then how to do it.
Sure. To the first question, though, around why don't private companies train more, I believe legally it's illegal to provide training to an independent contractor. They're supposed to come in, do a project, do a task. The assumption is that they're coming in with the skills to do it. So that classification, I'm sure there's tons of companies that don't follow that, but technically it is illegal to provide. And that goes to this question of the long-standing debate about classification of workers.
If you've trained them, then they're your employee.
Yes, and then they receive certain benefits. From our perspective, I mean, what we've been trying to do, we didn't start out as a policy and advocacy program. We started out as a workforce development program. And what we realized is that there's a lot that has to happen within both government and sort of the legal infrastructure. So we do now have a policy arm based on the data that we're getting from our trainees. And some of the stuff that has to shift is just incentives for organizations that receive state funding or national funding to provide this kind of training. Right now under DOL, independent work does not count as a work outcome that they can put into, like a nonprofit that provides skills training cannot count an independent work contract as an outcome that they were responsible for. So if you think about it, whether it's at the federal level or at the state level or at the city level, that's sort of a shift where the workforce development system has not caught up to the reality of how people are working. And what we see is that it's not a binary. The reality is that most people are going to ebb and flow through a period of some type of W-2 work, maybe some type of contract work, and a combination of both. And so when you sort of break out of that binary framework, then it doesn't make sense to not give organizations credit for doing this kind of training. So that's something that we realized once we got into the training space, is that a lot of workforce development organizations don't even think about providing them because they're quite frankly not incentivized or resourced to do it. So that's an issue.
And is that changing?
We are slowly starting to make dents, and I think part of the issue is that there isn't enough data to help push the conversation forward. Depending on what data source you're looking at, the incidence of independent work could be anywhere from 10 or 11%, which was the recent BLS data release, all the way to 30 to 40% if you're doing it on a supplemental, different hours, different months. So a lot of it has to be that we need to get to a shared understanding of like what is the incidence of independent work, how much of an issue is it, before then we can solve the policy. But I think a lot of the organizations that work with us, we are getting them to understand what the issues are, and that's why they partner with us.
Mm-hmm.
The training issue, I think, also is not just about the initial training to get the skills to get the job. There's also an ongoing training issue. So if you think about some of these job professions that are, for lack of a better term, flipping over to be predominantly independent workers from a traditional workforce, a lot of them have ongoing training requirements for certification or to keep up your licensure. So things like medical coding, things like nursing, there's ongoing training requirements that when you were a W-2 worker and working for a company, those were paid for and built into your employment. And now that you're on your own doing the same thing, you're now responsible for that ongoing certification and training.
Hmm. And on the training question, a couple of policies that we've proposed that extend beyond independent workers, but that address the training question. On the employer side is a worker training tax credit, so a credit for employers for offering training, similar to the research and development tax credit. And then more for workers is lifelong learning and training accounts to make savings accounts more accessible to pay for ongoing training, as Duke is saying, over the course of one's career.
And is that something that you run into, Sarah, like sort of upskilling yourself? Like, how do you handle that? Do you, technology changes and, you don't have an IT system that's going to put you through the training for some new software that you should learn. I mean, how do you handle that?
I think, and sometimes I think we glamorize that employers are doing this right, and that those of us who are self-employed are entirely missing out on it. So I think we're doing what actually a lot of people within companies also do if they're not quite getting what they need, which is essentially being creative, learning the hard way. But I'm lucky I'm a researcher, so essentially the more research I do, the more I learn. And so I think I'm a little bit exceptional in this regard. But I do feel that there's always time and energy that moves into whether it's training, whether it's better understanding even the mental energy that goes into filing for taxes, navigating my self-employed world. And I think the themes here are there's products that are coming into this space, there's people and organizations helping to navigate the processes, but none of this is a substitute for the policies that we need. And so I sort of feel that a lot of us are sort of stuck in the first two Ps with products and processes, and just really, really wishing that the broader overarching policy environment, which is just essentially not putting self-employed people at a disadvantage. And I just cannot understand how that's not something everyone can get behind and adjust policies to do, but obviously there are a lot of incentives and structures behind this. But I feel that there's space for all of us, but I wish we didn't need the products. I wish it wasn't necessary to navigate these processes because it puts us at a disadvantage while policies catch up.
So when you say policies, can you talk a little bit about which policies you could, if you were in charge, we would put into place?
I would not have self-employed people pay more taxes than regular employed people, which I don't think just must be a wish list or a dream, because it does not come up in any recommendation. And every self-employed person I talk to, the day you realize that you pay more taxes and you don't get any of the benefits that people get who they're employed if they're getting these benefits, so there's the kind of the hidden opportunity cost, and then there's the actual cost, is a really rough one. And you think, gosh, why does anyone do this? And then add, having to purchase things, and I don't want to glamorize it, that we're the American dream or that I don't have a boss. It's just that I find this to be more viable at this point in time to pursue this path. But it shouldn't be that people are having to jump into the self-employment waters because the employment ship is rocky and sinking. It should be that both of these have adequate safety nets within them. But all I really want is an even keel, not paying more taxes, being able to get a mortgage. and not being penalized every year when I can't accurately predict if my income is going to be 25% less or 25% more, which is currently happening every single year one way or another.
One note on the mortgage question is just 2 weeks ago, Senator Warner, along with Mike Rounds from South Dakota, introduced bipartisan legislation to increase the types of income documentation for mortgages to allow more self-employed persons to become homeowners.
And it's not just mortgages. I think self-employed people have challenges accessing the credit markets in general, mortgages being the biggest one, but credit cards, everything else, the whole FICO and everything else, that the whole system is set up around, again, the traditional employment setting.
So let's talk about sort of portable benefits programs, other programs that might be sort of interesting. Maybe we can go down the whole panel and you could talk about like which program you think is sort of interesting, exciting, what problem does it address, and so maybe we could just start with David. Like, are there sort of like specific programs or policies that
Sure. I mean, the first thing I would say is maybe a plug for research, which is not a policy per se, but I think it really would inform some of the policy making in this space. So I really agree with what Duke said earlier about, in the retirement space, for example, when the employer is just in the background helping you do things, signing you up for retirement, or you have to opt out. We don't really know to what extent the independent workforce touches employer-like institutions who could be doing that for them. Maybe it's the payroll provider, maybe it's a union, maybe it's a religious organization that they're affiliated with. But if they're truly independent, if they're truly just a one-man shop, then they're always going to have to be the one, ultimately, that makes the decision to save for retirement, say. But I don't know if we have a great sense of, and I should check the data hub, I'm sure it would be there if it did exist, but I don't think we have a great sense of the association that all these workers necessarily have with an institution that could play that role. Another idea that what we've been thinking a lot about is, retirement savings is great, but there's also a need for short-term emergency savings, especially as income and cash flows are moving up and down in unpredictable ways. And so to what extent could we kind of simultaneously automatically enroll people in a short-term savings account that sits alongside a long-term savings account, sometimes dubbed a sidecar account or a rainy day fund. And I think we have the technology now to be smart about, okay, once that rainy day account gets up to $1,000, we start funding the longer term stuff, and you kind of do some mental accounting with the participants so that they know which one is supposed to be liquid and which one isn't. So that's one idea that I think. Do you think,
is it more than idea anywhere? Like, is anyone talking about actually?
So there is legislation in the Senate that would, again, this kind of butts up against the ERISA regulatory structure I mentioned before, because employers, aren't allowed to just automatically sign up their employees for any benefit under the sun. There's lots of rules about that as well. There should be. And so there is a bill in the Senate that's sponsored by Senator Heitkamp and a bipartisan group that would allow employers to experiment in this way by enrolling their workers in sidecar short-term savings accounts as well as the retirement account. And there also are products out there that are already probably that are doing this for contingent or independent workers who can take a bit off of their payroll every time they get paid, and it goes into a savings account.
Great. Shelley, do you have any?
Yeah, I think I'll be brief because we've already mentioned it, but the Black Car Fund is a great place to look. And I'd say that not necessarily because of the specifics of that program, but because it offers specifics and it gives something concrete for other organizations and localities to look to. It specifies who's paying, who's benefiting, and what benefits are provided, which are really the key questions.
And what do you think makes that program work?
I think that there's been thought and energy put into those questions, and that there's been involvement with multiple key stakeholders, from the drivers to companies, worker organization. All of those voices are heard in its creation and maintenance and recent expansion, and I think that's really central.
Right. I think two things that are sort of interesting about that program to me is that A, it was established by state legislation with support from the industry. And second of all, the rates have not increased much in the last 17 years that they've been in business, so they have this sort of model. So that's sort of interesting. Kosar, do you have any other sort of portable benefit programs?
We agree with that, but I think on a separate note, just both on the government side and philanthropy, just rethinking how we incentivize employment outcomes. So it's not just government that I might complain about. A lot of the folks that fund us, we had to do a lot of education to get them up to speed to understand why an independent work outcome is something worth their investment. So we have a lot of, I think, outdated employment outcomes around, did you get a job? Is it W-2? Do you retain it for 90 days? You know, why does 90 days make sense anymore in the current, you know, economic conditions that we work in? So I think both on the government and philanthropy and anyone else who's investing resources in workforce development.
Mm-hmm. So, and do you think that's changing as people understand that more of the workforce doesn't
Very
fall?
glacially.
All right. Any portable benefit programs?
Yeah, look, I'm not a policy expert. I'm the guy representing private enterprise here, but I will say that we're for anything policy-wise that will help simplify the financial lives of the freelance workforce and make them more successful. But we're also not waiting for policy to happen. We are trying to create some of those systems of behaviors in order to do that. So if a freelancer signs up and joins BSolo, we are trying to create that automatic mechanism for us to peel off and save for them for taxes today. Why do we start with taxes? Because that's the biggest blocker to short-term savings or long-term savings and emergency savings. They need the cash flow and the liquidity. Once we solve that, we absolutely have aspirations to address other issues along the way and in other aspects, whether it's healthcare savings, long-term savings, other types of benefits. But taxes for us was the biggest blocker that we saw in all of the research.
And do you see that private enterprise, I mean, I see once in a while, like things cross my desk where, oh, hey, this is a new financial tool to help contractors. Is there a lot of innovation?
Yeah,
effective innovation?
I think you're starting to see a lot of movement and a lot of support for independent workers in the private enterprise, right? Earlier this year, we actually ran a competition for startups, other startups, in conjunction with another company in this space. And it was amazing to see the types of pitches that were coming out, whether it was people trying to solve healthcare, people trying to solve the space issue and finding a space to work, people trying to solve just different services that freelancers need, people trying to solve the loneliness and the companionship problem that freelancers have. It's very isolating. There's a lot of startups and other organizations that are starting to do something about this because everybody's starting to see this groundswell of people in this workforce and see some of the needs that they have.
Mm-hmm. Sarah, did you want to add anything or like a portable benefit program that maybe you signed up for that works well for you?
I'm just hoping for the benefits, and then I'll stress about how to make them portable.
All right. Okay. All right. Great. So maybe we should go to questions, Q&A, if people have any for the panel. It's not working.
So I'm Andy Schreiner from Fidelity. We do public policy work, and one of the things that we're doing some additional research on, Dave, you and I have talked a little bit about in the past, is I think right now the panel is very much focused on the future of the workforce. But what about people who are retiring, right? And the employers who sometimes have a struggle with workers that maybe are struggling to leave the workforce, and this concept of phased retirement. And is there an opportunity here to also look at older workers who might want to downshift and still work and have that feeling of connectivity to their employer but might not want to work full time, employers who might want to still have that expertise on board but might not want to pay as much for all the healthcare and other benefits that they have. And I'm just curious, David or Shelley, if you've heard anything about that aspect of kind of the future of work and in this, people needing to work longer and transitioning into retirement.
Definitely a topic that has come up many times. I think it's a really interesting one. I know I'm always taken aback when I see the stats of like who is actually in the gig economy. It's often a lot of older folks who like are trying to supplement a retirement or try to stay connected to a community. I know Brookings is is writing a paper right now on this very question because I think there are some regulatory issues, right, around age discrimination and other things that would come up if you try to pursue a phased retirement approach. But I think it's worth exploring for sure. Yeah.
And do you think that contract work is sort of making, for older workers, adding to financial security, or is is it taking away from it if you had to sort of look at the numbers and suggest, you know?
It's a tough question. I mean, yeah, I don't have the answer to that. I think the whole panel today, we've kind of been dancing a little bit around this tension, right, and I think one of the reasons that the classification question is so hard for policymakers to figure out, in part, is because there is a sense of kind of a race to the bottom if you kind of grease the wheels to make it easier for employers to to give you just tasks at a time instead of a full-fledged job with benefits, then that could be reducing financial security overall, right? But we also don't want to stick our heads in the sand and say, look, these trends are happening in the economy, we should build rules that address them. So I think that's part of that tension.
Any other questions from the audience? Yes.
I'm just going to sit for now, just because I'm 39 weeks pregnant, so I'm not trying to be rude. But my name is Carolina Young. I'm the Future of Work Policy Advisor for Senator Mark Warner. I'm happy to plug the portable benefits legislation that he introduced last year that Aspen is extremely familiar with, where you have a pot of federal funding that would allow states and localities and nonprofits to also experiment in this benefit space to really try to let the innovation happen much more at the local level. But one of the questions that I had, and it's probably specific mostly to COSAR, I'm just sort of interested to see if, I know you're a direct, you deliver training directly. And so I was just kind of wondering what would be some of the ideal strategies for federal and state partnerships to create the kind of training programs that would be effective, not just for independent workers, but you can imagine workers that are really trying to transition in between these sort of W-2 and independent jobs back and forth, given that we sort of some of the research that we see on this front, employers are really sort of the crucial sort of participant in that equation, because they kind of know exactly what the skills are needed in order to be competitive in the future. So I kind of wanted to get your thoughts on this. What's an ideal public policy partnership that would could develop in this space?
I don't know that I have the ideal, but I can say that there's a couple of things. One is the organizations that provide technical skills for the most vulnerable workers right now are not keeping pace with sort of what's in demand. So I think there's ideas around apprenticeships, like some kind of program where you're embedded in a company, and so they exactly know what skills are up and coming, and they give you those training. Because what we see is, for our clientele at least, they want training on two parts of the equation. One is they think they don't have enough technical skills for whatever their industry is. So if they're in IT, they're like, I'm falling behind in certifications, and that's outside of sort of our wheelhouse, but it's more on the community-based organization or wherever they're getting their skills training program. So one is just the skills matching, which I think the Congressman talked about too, like how do we help people upskill fast enough? And then the other is how do we make resources like ours, which is a different set of skills, maybe more soft skills, right? It's about client management, client acquisition, it's about personal branding, all these things that you don't necessarily learn in a typical jobs program where they just say, hey, give me your resume and I'll make some edits and let's put this out there. It's a whole different type of much more entrepreneurial pursuit of work. And that, I think, with the technology and tools that we have an online curriculum that we offer right now. I think it's fairly easy to provide that kind of training at no cost to people in a way where you don't have to come into a city or federally funded employment center. Like, you should be able to go online and get this training right away. So if there was a fund that could fund organizations like ours to scale that, because that's our issue, right? We've developed a curriculum that's based on needs of low-income workers, so we actually have piloted, iterated a lot, but then we're not getting the investment we need to scale that at a national level. So I think that would be one thing that we could do, and then the skills part I think is a much harder part.
And the language issue that you talked about before, about the Department of Labor defining who can receive these kinds of funds.
Right, if that funding could go for a program like this, that would ease that a lot.
Okay, well, I think we are unfortunately at the end of our time. Is that right?
Yeah. So quickly thank Yuki for moderating the panel. Thank you to all of the panelists for coming. I appreciate everybody taking 2 hours of a break from weather updates to listen to this. And obviously thanks to Congressman Himes and his staff for helping put this together and participate in this event. So again, thanks to everybody. Have a good day. Thank you.